Welcome to all WCL members. In this lesson, our theme is the check. When to give a check, why to give a check, and when not to give a check. That's what we're going to discuss. Typically, the check has special significance to non-chess players or newcomers to the game. They believe that the check has a special importance and almost like is the purpose of the game. Well, that's certainly not the case, and I'll demonstrate that in some of the examples that we're going to see in this lesson. Of course, the check can be important, but in itself, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is. So we shall see examples on both cases. Here we go with our first example, which is from a real game between two grandmasters, Volkov and Sargsyan, played in 2002. In this position, it is White's turn, and it's a pretty normal position with symmetrical pawn structure and even material. Such games very often end up with a draw result. White in this position could give a check on e4, but ultimately it has no real purpose. Black can easily escape from it or even block it. White didn't even choose to give a check, but developed with bishop e3, which is certainly a wise thing to do. Black chose to relocate his knight to a more active position on f6. And White came back, and Black played knight d7. Both sides are kind of maneuvering, not exactly knowing where they are going. But now the Black knight arrived to b6 with a kind of a idea of coming to c4, targeting the b2 pawn. And now White played b3, preventing the Black knight from coming to c4. Of course, the drawback of this is that it leaves the White knight on c3 on an unprotected square. And Black jumped knight b4, attacking it right away. If the knight moves, the catch is that the pawn on a2 may fall. White protects the knight with bishop e5 and came knight d7. These are not very important moves from our lesson's perspective. However, I just wanted to show that all these moves were waiting moves. And here, finally, we got to the critical moment of the game, where Black was so busy with maneuvering and trying to attack the White bishop that he forgot about the fact that a check actually can be deadly. And in this case, the problem is that Black has just put his knight carelessly on an unprotected square on c2 on the same diagonal with his king, and forgot about this simple check with bishop e4 and lost the knight. So yes, always be aware of checks. What's important about checks is that you always, at all times, need to be aware of the possible checks. And then you can judge, is it a dangerous check because it involves a fork or something else, or is just a regular, insignificant check. And that comes with experience and practice that you'll get a better and quicker feel for it in your own games. Let's move on to our next example, where it was Black's turn. White has just attacked the Black knight on d5 with the rook. And as we can see, Black is 2 pawns up in this endgame. While it's certainly unclear if that's sufficient to win the game, but at the same time, it's undoubtful that it is Black who is playing to win. And this is one of those typical situations when you have to be very careful before giving a check, because a check does not necessarily mean that it's a good move. Here, Grandmaster Shirov, who is one of the top players of our time, against Grandmaster Gurevich gave one of those quick checks on g4, assuming that white king must move, and then knight moves away. At first, this check looks quite effective because the white king cannot successfully move to the f-file because of the upcoming fork with rook f4 and then capturing the knight. However, the problem is that after the white king moves to h2, all of a sudden, neither does the black rook or knight have a check. At the same time, the black knight is still hanging, and when Shirov moved his knight away, he had to realize that all of a sudden he's no longer playing for a win, and he's in for a short or long-term defense, trying to defend an endgame with an exchange down. It's true that at the moment black still has 2 pawns also, but those 2 pawns are likely to get lost real quick. And then, while of course it's still a theoretical draw, rook versus knight, but black will be certainly on the suffering side. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. In this position, it is black's turn. It's very important to always be aware on what your opponent's threats are. And I bet you can quickly tell that white has a serious threat, namely to fork with the knight coming to e6. Black did not like the idea that after the natural queen d6, which stops this fork, white will play bishop h3, a quite powerful move, and then play rook e1, and black indeed looks in a pretty miserable position. Instead, black chose to play knight d6 in hopes that if white now forks with knight e6 and then captures the queen, black will do just that to white after also forking the white king and queen with knight e4. I suggest you try to figure out what was wrong with this idea of black's by playing knight d6. In this case, not only that very first check with knight e6 is important, but it's important not to stop the calculation prematurely. This is one of those positions indeed where calculation is necessary. I like to point out oftentimes that in many positions in chess, for example, if you remember our very first position in this endgame, where both sides were kind of moving back and forth, not much calculation is required. However, the position that we have in front of us right now is exactly the type of position when you have to have accurate calculation and, of course, precise evaluation. Here the point is that after knight e6 and king c8 and knight captures queen and knight e4 check and the king moves out of the check and knight takes, black only counted on king capturing knight, in which case black's position would be fine after rook captures knight on f8. The problem for black arises after white has an intermediate checks. My general rule of thumb is never stop a calculation until you see an upcoming check or capture. The problem now is that the black king is being forced to a square where it can be checked again by white's knight. And therewith, the white knight is on a safe square, while after black gets out from this second check, white is free to capture the free knight and maintain a significant material advantage. Let's move on to the next example, which is a very famous one from a game played in 1928. As we can tell from the remaining pieces on the board, that this game started as a Ruy Lopez and a variation of the Marshall attack. Black has sacrificed the knight on f2, and is hoping to win the material back by playing bishop g3, and that's exactly what black did. However, black forgot about a check opportunity for white. If now white would simply move the queen away, for example by queen f3, bishop would capture rook, and after queen captures rook and bishop takes h3, black's attack would be extremely strong in view of most of the white pieces being stuck on the queen side of the chessboard. Let's go back. However, here white has an immediately winning move. Hope you can figure this one out. White can sacrifice the queen with a check, very importantly, and when rook captures, the black rook is in a pin right now, and rook e8 checkmates. It's important to point out that after bishop g3, bishop takes pawn would not do the trick, because in this case, the black rook would not be forced to capture the bishop, but could simply move out of the check, maintaining the threat on the white queen and rook, and black would be much better. So going back to the starting position, the question continues, what should black do? And this is a very typical example of how important and effective an intermediate check can be. Here, instead of coming to g3 with the bishop right away, black is much better off in playing bishop h2 check first. Now, king cannot take the bishop without losing the queen on f2, needs to go to f1, and now the bishop retreating to g3 already accomplishes a whole lot more for black. Here, white cannot play queen f3 and then capture the rook, because an immediate checkmate would end the game. And also, if after bishop h2 check and king f1, bishop g3, white would try the same trick with queen f7, here comes the huge difference. After rook f7, white is in check. And therefore, obviously, white has no time to checkmate himself with rook e8. Always be aware who is in check and what are the checking opportunities. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, white has an extra pawn and obviously could play something very normal, such as moving the rook away from the attack. However, in situations when the opponent's king is wandering around far away from the safety of the king's side and the fg and h pawns, for example, then it's a red flag. It's certainly an invitation to keep chasing that king until it gets checkmated, or will result in winning significant material. And this example is no different. White's best option is to check the king. Now in this case, the king has difficulty in moving onto this diagonal where the black queen is, because then immediately a skewer would appear from behind. On the other hand, if the black king captures the rook, the result will be kind of similar. After white captures the pawn and then forces the black king onto that same skewer with queen h7 and wins the queen on c2. Let's go on to the next example. Here we go. This is a very nice endgame composed by Troitsky. Black has the material advantage. Nevertheless, if white continues correctly, black cannot keep his queen long on the board. It seems that the black queen has plenty of places to go, but in reality, after white's next move, it will not find safety. It's another important moment that giving the check does not necessarily mean that it's a good move. The king can simply move out to a6 and be fine. Much better is to play knight f5 and attack the queen. And if you look carefully around, you'll notice that anywhere the black queen goes, it will be lost. For example, if queen f7, a nice fork. If queen e6, fork but from d4. Or if after knight f5, the queen captures the pawn on b4, then not a knight fork, but a skewer with the rook, rook b8. And finally, if the queen goes to e5, then rook a5 ends the life of the queen. Let's move on. Here we go. While in this endgame white has a minimal material advantage, typically it would not be enough to win the game, unless white can either give checkmate real soon or win further material. Again, it's a moment where giving the check would be a huge mistake and would give away the win. The black king would get out of the check, and then after king attacks the rook, rook just goes away and black is okay. On the other hand, if white finds the correct move, which is king c3, the black rook is pretty much trapped, because anywhere it goes, it will end up facing the bishop's attack and leaving black no escape for the rook. Very nice. Let's move on to the next example, which is from a real game again between Grandmasters Adorjan and Tukmakov. In this position, black has a couple of checks at his disposal, but neither of them really work. If black right now immediately would play knight e2, which is a check, and it looks pretty good because it is also a discovery at the same time. The problem is that white king does not need to move out of the check. In contrary, the white bishop can and should capture that knight that just gave the check, and sadly for black, now that same bishop protects the rook on d1. So therefore this check would not be a good idea. The same would be the problem if black would try to check with a discovery with knight f3. The problem now would be that the white queen would capture the knight and again protect the rook. However, if you think you can find the correct move for black that actually will result in material gain. And that key move is to play rook b8. Now the white queen is attacked and it can no longer remain in that crucial long diagonal from where it controls the f3 square. White captured the pawn on a6, and now white cannot avoid loss of material after the discovery with knight f3 check. Pawn takes and queen takes rook, and white is lost. Let's move on to an endgame, a rook endgame in fact, where it seems that black is in an extremely good shape. Because now, if white simply would capture the pawn on e2, all of a sudden, black checkmates with rook h3. So what should white do in this starting position? The black pawn is almost promoting. Well, this is where intermediate checks are so important. White can first give a check, and then give a second check. Now, if the black king moves back towards the corner, we just keep checking over and over. And if the king tries to escape, then already we're safe to capture the pawn, because rook h3 is no longer a checkmate, the white king can escape. A very nice little trick. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Well, I'm not saying that this is a very likely position to happen in all of your games. However, at the same time, it beautifully and very effectively demonstrates what the windmill idea is all about. I suggest you take a few minutes and try to figure out and have fun on your own. Figure out how white should win here. And here is the answer. Check and check. And the discoveries keeps coming. Bishop e6, discover, check. And then back again, forcing the king into a discovery, picking up all those pawns on the diagonal. Back to g8 and capturing the pawn again. And again, back to g8, king h8, and capturing the pawn again. And check again, and capturing the pawn. What's next? We captured everything we could on the bishop's way. That's true, but it's not enough. We need to do more. Capturing black's queen right now, right away, is not sufficient because black would have a bishop and pawn for white's extra rook after that trade on b1, and black would have excellent chances to save the game. So the trick is, we go back one more last time, and then we go to b3 check, king h7, and we capture the bishop with a fork, forcing queen takes bishop, rook takes queen, and now, of course, the material advantage is easily winning for white. I hope you enjoyed this very cute jewel of the week and understand a bit better about when to give checks and when not to give checks. But you need to remember, always be aware of when and where checks are available. It doesn't mean, though, that A, you have to be afraid of them, or B, you see a check and you necessarily have to give it. However, be aware of your options or of your opponents. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess knowledge. Bye-bye.